meet you too. I was at the lunch the other day with your at your offices and enjoying your materials because coming up to the rest of the
Good.
It's my weekend reading.
Oh, sorry, it's your weekends then, but that's great. Thank you for the rest of your
Sure, absolutely. I am interested to learn more about we actually had a collaboration with the
yeah, so I mean, I worked on
Do you love it when you stand before an audience and there's silence? Good morning and welcome. We're so pleased to have such a great turnout for our dialogue today. I am Roger Mark D'Souza and I direct our programs on global sustainability and resilience here at the Wilson Center. And we're really pleased to welcome you to the center. I don't know how many of you are familiar with us. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson. He's the only president thus far to have had a PhD, and we focus on bringing the worlds of analysis and policy and program implementation together. And because we serve as the living memorial to President Wilson, there are a few things that we think are really important to our mission and the work that we do. The first is that we feel that we have a very strong trust to the American people to understand global issues. We are a think tank, but we bring together these worlds of analysis, policy, and program application to the American public and make sure that we have international perspectives that inform dialogue in the United States on these issues. The second area that we consider really important is that we bring together scholarship and policy, making sure that we provide a breadth and depth of knowledge on global issues. And we are particularly pleased today that we can do that in the context of climate change leading up to the Paris negotiations and being able to inform some of the dimensions that we know will be discussed in Paris and beyond. And finally, we actively work to bring the world to the United States, listening very carefully to how others discuss issues around the world so that we can help people in the United States policy community understand how we in the United States can play a constructive role in global affairs. And part of what we'll be focusing on today is how do we think about charging ahead and scaling up renewable energy in the developing world and making sure that we have some access to those global perspectives. We're really pleased to convene today with support from USAID's Office of Global Climate Change. They're working with us in our Environmental Change and Security Program to collaborate on a series of 3 climate change and development meetings and events. And this is the first that starts off this series, and it's in recognition of the critical intersection of renewable energy and efforts that help address the climate change challenges and opportunities that we are facing. So I think as we think of some of the opportunities around the climate change, I'd like to get started with our agenda and welcome Carrie Thompson, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. I think you have Carrie's bio. I hope you've picked up the bios of the speakers that we have. But she joined the Bureau E3 in September 2015 as Deputy Assistant Administrator, and comes with a very good purview of overseeing work on global climate change, forestry, and biodiversity, and also looking at issues around land tenure and resources management. She's recently come back to Washington, D.C., but she had come from working at USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia, based in Bangkok, and has a career that has spanned working in a number of USAID offices and issues, from East African affairs to having served in Guatemala and Central America programs, some time in Peru and also El Salvador. So wonderful perspective and range of experience that Carrie brings to our discussion today. And she's very excited because she said to me, I'm going to spend most of the day with you, and it's very unusual for me to be able to pencil that time out in my schedule. So we're quite thrilled that you're joining us today, Carrie, and I'd like to invite you to come up to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Roger Mark, for that nice introduction. It's really exciting for me to be here today. Just back from Bangkok. We have a major environment and climate program in Bangkok, but I didn't work so directly on it there, and I'm having the opportunity day to day to learn more. So I'm going to sit in all day long today to really get up the learning curve on clean energy. We're very excited to be co-hosting with the Wilson Center this critical and timely forum, Scaling Up Renewable Energy in the Developing World. And thanks to the Wilson Center staff for their terrific work in organizing the event. I know that our Associate Administrator, Eric Postel, really wanted to be here to open the event, but he was called away at the last minute, and so he asked me to relay his regrets. So first, I'd like to welcome everybody here in the room, and for those who are listening on online streaming, I, like many of you, had the opportunity to watch the momentum for renewable energy build exponentially since 2009, when the U.S. Global Climate Change Initiative first began at USAID. Clean energy has gone from being the right thing to do in combating climate change to being the most cost-effective option for many energy-insecure countries. It's an interesting transition. Increasingly, emerging markets like India, Mexico, and South Africa are setting ambitious targets for scaling up renewable energy and are attracting private sector capital to do it. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who are here with us today, renewables will command just under 60% of the almost 10,000 gigawatts of new generating capacity installed over the next 25 years, and 2/3 of the $12 trillion in expected investment. We are seeing this largely because renewables are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many markets. Another trend we are witnessing is that between now and 2014, developing countries will build nearly 3 times as much new energy capacity as developed nations. As a leading development agency, USAID is among the global actors playing a key role in ensuring developing countries can attract clean energy investment and take part in this global trend. USAID's Global Climate Change Initiative is helping more than 20 countries put the building blocks in place to scale up renewable energy. Clean energy is a healthy and sustainable development option that USAID is delighted to support. Development fueled by clean energy will help to enhance energy security and access in sensitive regions, promote cleaner air and better health in congested urban areas, and fuel economic growth in energy-poor communities. Globally, USAID is helping to promote regulatory innovations, new types of purchasing agreements, and incentives such as feed-in tariffs and auctions to build a strong global green economy. The exciting news is that the reforms of developing countries to encourage clean energy generation and the efforts of organizations such as USAID are leading to a rapid scale-up of clean energy. In India, for example, utility-scale photovoltaic, or PV, is expected to reach parity with new coal by 2023. India tapped U.S. expertise to design successful new policies, vastly scaling up clean energy, first setting a goal to install 20,000 megawatts of solar PV generation capacity, and then increasing that goal to 100,000 megawatts in 2015. USAID thinks in terms of building blocks for scaling up clean energy. These building blocks are the drivers behind scaling up in countries that are leading the surge in renewable energy generation, such as China, Germany, India, South Africa, and the United States. We'll share insights about the building blocks in the panel this afternoon. Improving power grids is one of the USAID building blocks for scaling up clean energy. This is because introducing large amounts of energy from intermittent sources like wind and solar are challenging for the best electrical grids to distribute. So in large countries such as India and in regions such as the Black Sea and West, East, and Southern Africa, USAID and other donors support partnerships to enhance power grid reliability and integration of large-scale renewables. Another example of USAID's work in this space is through President Obama's Power Africa initiative. I'm sure many of you know of it. Through Power Africa, USAID works in partnership with the world's top companies, African governments, international organizations, NGOs, and bilateral and multilateral donors that are stimulating investment in sub-Saharan African energy sector. Power Africa is working to generate capacity in 60 million electricity connections throughout sub-Saharan Africa, a region of the world where 2 out of 3 people lack access to reliable electricity. What's particularly exciting about Power Africa is the opportunity to work with our African government partners on renewable energy options. Sub-Saharan Africa has vast clean energy resources that, when developed responsibly and distributed widely, can transform the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Indeed, Power Africa is helping to put the African sun to work, as well as the wind, water, and geothermal resources, by removing the financial and regulatory roadblocks that for too long have stood in the way of power delivery on the continent. For our part, USAID has agreed to a $75 million Development Credit Authority guarantee earlier this year that aims to increase financing for the off-grid renewable energy sector across sub-Saharan Africa. This guarantee is designed to support the working capital needs of producers, manufacturers, and distributors of renewable energy technologies, and support financing for end users of these technologies. Power Africa is an example of the U.S. government's new model of development, one that is based on effective partnerships that link public and private sector goals and resources, and connects investors and entrepreneurs to business opportunities in Africa. Power Africa's approach to the development of sub-Saharan Africa's energy sector and its focus on renewables will improve the lives and energize economies across the African continent. So not only are we seeing progress on energy in Africa, but also globally, as Ethan Zindler from Bloomberg will surely tell us during the first panel. We are witnessing a significant shift in the cost to generate renewable energy compared to fossil fuels. I'd venture to say that the progress made on clean energy by entrepreneurs, utilities, partner countries, and organizations like USAID marks a major contribution to global climate action as the world's nations prepare for the 2015 climate talks in Paris. And the momentum for clean energy will only continue to grow. It'll continue to grow because this is as much a bottom-up movement fueled by open markets and cost competitiveness, people's desire for clean air, and businesses' need for a reliable energy supply, as it is a policy priority for governments around the world. Clean energy is indeed a bright spot in our efforts to make progress in dealing with climate challenges at scale and fueling development that ends poverty and creates new opportunities for growth. So I'm really excited to see so many people from the private sector, government, and civil society dedicated to this topic and here today to compare notes on this promising development trend. In closing, I hope we take the opportunity today to share ideas on key trends as we head into the COP21. We also have an occasion to promote best practices, as in a new tool that USAID has just launched, to which I would like to draw your attention, and I think many of you have seen it on a screen out in the lobby. USAID's new global knowledge portal for climate change and development, climatelync's.org. Representatives from ClimateLynx will be here all day to share with you how you can best engage and benefit from the site. We look forward to hearing your own best practices also in the course of today's program. So in just a few minutes, Roger Mark will introduce the first panel, but let me give you a very brief overview of the day. Our opening panel features 3 speakers who can discuss the trends we are seeing today in renewable energy as they apply to the developing world. After lunch, we'll hear from a panel of speakers who are working on the building blocks that I mentioned that help to take the renewable energy to scale. Later in the afternoon, we'll have a chance to hear about how renewable energy fits in the development and climate change imperatives. And finally, we'll be joined by the distinguished Mohammed El Ashri from the UN Foundation, who will share his reflections on the themes we are discussing today. So thanks again to all of you for joining us today. I think it'll be a great session, a lot of opportunity to talk about this really important and promising topic and to engage with one another. So I'll turn it back now to Roger Mark.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I think that's an excellent way to get us started thinking about, at one point this was the right thing to do, but now it just makes sense. It makes economic sense. It's being cost effective. How do we look at what it means for investment opportunity? What are the benefits that we're seeing in terms of health benefits? What does it mean in terms of the reforms that are being put in place? And what does it mean for opportunities for scaling up? As we look at power grid reliability and integration of renewables, what are we learning? What's working? What has not worked? As we look at what we're doing from a development perspective, this new model for development that Carrie talks about. What are we learning from Power Africa? What is the real potential to actually transform lives, and to recognize that this is a multifaceted approach that involves the market, that involves looking at competition, and that involves the corporate sector, involves civil society, government, and donor agencies. So an excellent setting for the day. I'm really excited. This is great. So I'd like to invite our panelists for the first panel to please come up. And I'd like to also introduce the moderator for our panel. So I'll ask you to go ahead and please come up and join us. So our first panel today on renewable energy, declining prices and growing opportunities is going to be moderated by Zofreen Ibrahim. And as you can see from the information that you have, Zofreen is based in Karachi and has been working independently, contributing to a number of English dailies in Pakistan, including Dawn, The New News, and a number of monthly magazines such as Herald and Newsline. We at the Wilson Center met Zofreen a few years ago when she participated in a training program that we had in our collaboration with the Society of Environmental Journalists, helping journalists understand how to cover various technical issues. We were meeting in Chattanooga, and Zofreen was involved in that effort. She also collaborates with a number of our other partners, such as Population Reference Bureau, part of a very elite group of journalists called Women's Edition that are covering key development issues, and is a leading journalist in that effort. So Zofreen, welcome, and I hope you're not too jet lagged, and we're going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for a very nice introduction, Roger. I'm honored and humbled to be invited here today by the Woodrow Wilson Center to moderate the morning session on renewable energy. The topic is bringing power to the people. On the panel today, we have top executives and major players from this very field, and they will discuss the current trends in the renewable energy landscape and the critical role clean energy can play in meeting development goals. They will also talk about the opportunities and challenges in scaling up renewable energy in the developing countries. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the day is Ethan Zindler. He's the head of policy analysis at the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He's responsible for managing coverage of key policy development globally impacting renewables, biofuels, and energy efficiency. I don't know about others, but he has a weekend car, an electric Nissan Leaf in his garage since the past 2 years, which he charges religiously every day, and he uses it on the weekend. For the rest of the week, he uses a bike. Mr. Zindler will give an overview of the high-level trends from the just released Energy Outlook report. Mike Eckhart is the Managing Director and Global Head of Environmental Finance and Sustainability at the Citigroup in New York City. In this role, he supports Citi's goal to be the leading financial services firm in the renewable energy efficiency, clean water, and related areas. He'll be our second speaker. The third speaker today will be Mr. Jake Cusack, who is the Managing Partner at Cross Boundary and Cross Boundary Energy. Cross Boundary Energy is building a dedicated fund for the commercial and industrial solar. He will tell us why renewable energy is good for the least developed country businesses and the opportunities and constraints as well as solutions emerging to overcome those constraints. And Haim Watson, I've got it right, co-founder and managing director of Gigawatt Global. And he's the driving force behind the recently set up 8.5 megawatt solar park in a youth orphan in a village in Rwanda, which is today providing power supply to some 18,000 homes. Yeah. He will tell us more about the solar park and the conditions organizations may want to consider in a particular region to succeed in their venture. So I'd like Mr. Ethan Zindler to come and talk about his.
So thanks and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope so. It's right in my face here. And thanks for that nice introduction and mention of my weekend car, although my wife is driving during the week. She commutes every day. And it's a great car. And for what it's worth, everyone writes a lot about the extraordinary pickup that the Tesla has. But any electric vehicle can get you 0 to 40 pretty darn fast, and including the Nissan Leaf. It doesn't look that cool, but it goes fast. So thanks for the shout out on that. I'm going to talk, actually, you know what? I also have some slides, and if you would throw those up first for just a sec. I'm going to try, hopefully, provide a little bit of a kind of an overview of what's going on in clean energy investment and deployment, which hopefully will set us up for further conversation. And I'll also talk a little bit about a project that we're very proud of, and of course want to say thanks to Carrie and to USAID for being supportive of it. I'll tell you a little bit about it in just a moment. But first, just very, very quickly, who I am and what I'm doing here. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is essentially an energy market research division of Bloomberg LP. There's about 200 of us around the world. We cover basically all energy sectors that are essentially zero carbon or lower carbon. We don't really cover coal and oil, but we cover just about everything else. And these are our clients, which is a mix of really, and we started really helping investors primarily about 10 years ago when we were started, but over time have grown more to serve the sort of conventional energy industry, utilities, and a number of government agencies, including the U.S. Department of Energy, State Department, and a number of others here in town, but I think about 15 or 20 other governments around the world also have access to our research as well. So what we do is we write a lot about developments in clean energy, but we also have a team of about 30 people globally that are literally trying to track every sizable transaction around the world so that we have the sort of ultimate database of what's going on in the industry. What I'm going to show you is some of that information. All right, so just to start off with, just as an overview, we've seen over $1.5 trillion invested in clean energy over a decade. And I think it's always important when we talk about clean energy, you kind of make sure you give the terms of what you're talking about here. What's not counted in this slide is we're not including nuclear, we are not including natural gas, we're not even including large hydro. So it's a fairly narrow definition of renewables. Plus what we call energy smart technologies. Those are technologies related to enabling energy efficiency and a smarter grid, and it's biofuels. So, you can see about $300 billion in investment total worldwide in 2014 last year. The sort of most exciting period in terms of dollar investment was, 2004 up through 2011 or so. And you might say, well, how come there was no sort of real effect by the recession, 2009 and 10, and one of the reasons was there was a lot of money poured into the industry in the form of stimulus from a lot of different governments around the world, including the U.S. government. And then as you look from 2010 to 2011 straight through to 2014, you see this kind of leveling. And of course you say, well, why is that? It's kind of a good news, bad news story. The bad news is there's not a whole lot of larger volumes of new capital coming in year on year. But the good news is because clean energy has gotten much cheaper, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, the amount of stuff that's getting built for the same number of dollars has been going up. So you're getting more bang for your buck when it comes to actual deployment. So I'm going to talk for a moment about Climatescope, which is the effort that we do focused specifically on emerging markets. What Climatescope is it's funded by, as I mentioned earlier, by USAID, by UK DFID, and the Inter-American Development Bank as well. At USAID, the specific support has come from the Power Africa initiative, and we're very grateful to them. And what it is, and it's actually already online from last year at global-climatescope.org, but what it is an effort to provide essentially actionable data for those trying to make strategic decisions about where to build clean energy and how to craft policies that are related to clean energy, to try to provide as much transparency as we can around activities going on in these markets. It is an index. Everyone loves lists. Everyone loves scores. So it's an index. We take 55 countries and we score all of them and we rank them. by which countries are the most receptive, essentially, or most hospitable to attracting clean energy private finance. And we've done it once on a global basis last year. We're going to do it again and release in a couple weeks. It's a report, so if you then want to, let's say, read about a specific country and all the activities that are going on in there, you can do that. It's an online tool. If you want to go on and do analysis and sort of rank countries in different ways along different metrics, you can do that. And then finally, it's a big data source. So we gather all kinds of information, everything from retail power prices to the cost of kerosene to a lot of information about local policies. And if you want to go ahead and download it all in a massive Excel sheet, you can do that. So hopefully it's helpful to some folks in the academic community and others as well. And we put it out once before, as I mentioned, but the next edition is coming actually in just a couple weeks. And by next edition, I mean the kind of rankings and the scores of top to bottom. So what I'm going to do is now, if this works, this will be nice. I'm going to try and show you some of the highlight results by switching over here. If I can switch it back for you. So this is flying with a high wire here, but this is actually online at the moment. And if you go to bnef.com afterwards, you can look it up. These are the high-level findings from this year's report. It's all on the web at the moment. And if this works, I'll be able to click forward. I may need you to just do a forward click for me. Cool. So again, this is the global investment. This is a slightly different cut, but it shows you the same pattern of total investment. This actually doesn't include what we call the energy efficiency spending or energy smart technology spending, but you can see the same general global pattern of investment. And in terms of what I didn't talk very much about is the geographic split. And what you can see is at the bottom, this green chunk here, this is all Europe, and this was sort of the heady days of European clean energy investment. And then this red chunk is China. And you can see how much China has grown over time. But you're also seeing other regions grow pretty quickly too. So this orange chunk is other parts of Asia as well. So you're seeing the world has really shifted from a very European-focused start, and Germany in particular being the kind of hub of where all this activity was happening, to a lot more of it becoming much more heterogeneous in terms of geographic, but also China playing a huge role in what's going on. If you would, next one. So the Climatescope countries, as I mentioned, this is 55 emerging market countries. Most notably, it includes the biggest emerging markets. It includes China, India, South Africa, Brazil. It also includes Mexico, among others. It's 26 countries in Latin America. It's 19 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's 10 countries in Asia. And you can see that the level at which the deployment has been going up in these countries is very quick, very sharp. The green countries, again, are the Climatescope, and sort of in an interesting development, at least for us, the green line, as you can see, has been trending up. This blue line represents OECD country development, but this past year, these Climatescope countries, again, this is this 55-country selection, more capacity was actually built in these emerging markets than was built in the OECD. And so we think that's sort of an important, noteworthy development. If you would, next one, thanks. So this is just to show that happened this year. Keep going. And of course, China, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is a huge, huge part of the story. So of that, about 50 gigawatts or 50,000 megawatts of clean energy capacity built in 2014, about 35 of that was in China. So it's just a massive, massive chunk of it. And China continues to grow sort of year on year. Mike Eckhart and I have worked together for a long time. China was basically nowhere in this industry like 6 or 7 years ago. And overnight, China is the largest manufacturer of solar equipment in the world. It's up there on wind. It doesn't export as much on wind equipment, but it's a major manufacturer of wind as well, serving its own market domestically. The Chinese, there are a lot of different things. We'll talk a lot about China, but one thing you can say is there is an understanding of the strategic value of manufacturing the equipment and exporting the equipment. They've seen the economic opportunity. They provided a tremendous amount of capital support locally to try and build up their local manufacturing industry. But I thought it important just to strip China out for a second from those 55 countries, since obviously they're the 10,000-pound gorilla. And even if you look without China, you can see that the rate at which the growth has been taking place in non-China Climatescope countries, that's those other 54 countries, has still been growing at a faster pace on a percentage basis than in OECD countries. So the rate at which activity is happening in these countries is faster overall. I'm going to, if you would, keep going. I'm just in the interest of time. I'm going to speed through a little bit here. You can stop, back up one if you could, because I want to talk just a little bit about Africa. So Africa is an interesting story, and there's really two parts of the Africa story. And I know that our panelists, I think, could talk a little bit about this as well. But there is the on-grid story, that is projects that are being built to connect to the existing grid. And then there's the massive amount of activity happening around the so-called off-grid. Last week here in town, there were several events that focused very much on off-grid activity. It's a fascinating area. And by off-grid, I'm talking about literally, in some cases, something as simple as a $5 solar lantern that someone has in their house and provides light, as opposed to having to run a kerosene generator to generate any kind of light after dark, or a candle, to something a little more sophisticated, which can mean a very tiny solar system, which consists of maybe a 3-foot by 3-foot solar module that you can use to charge a phone and light a few lights. But even that's a major step up, and it's much cleaner than burning kerosene or anything else. But anyway, just to talk for a second about the so-called on-grid, which is the projects that are built and connected to the grid, we actually have seen a ramp up of money invested in Africa really in 2012 and 13, but a bit of a decline in 2014. In fairness, part of it is because this is what you call sort of lumpy investment. That is, one big project comes along, or a couple big projects come along, it spikes the numbers. If you don't have a big project in a year, the dollar amounts kind of drop. So, and of course, the biggest part of the story, you probably can't see too well from back there, but is South Africa, which of course is the largest economy in Africa, or I guess debatably the largest economy in Africa, has accounted for the biggest chunk of the activity. There's a lot of room for a lot more activity. I think Chaim's going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff you're doing in Rwanda as well. Is that right? So there's plenty of other opportunities here. But the sort of good news is that money spent in prior years has become deployment in this past year. So South Africa may have seen a drop of investment, but that means big projects have come online this past year. And I'm gonna finish up, if you would, just you can skip through to the end. I just want to make one last point before we close. I had a slide which if we get into the discussion, I'm happy to show. But Carrie made the point, and I would just kind of reemphasize, which is that we've reached a really interesting time in terms of clean energy development in these countries. And I particularly put this within the context of the upcoming negotiations in Paris and all this discussion about technology transfer, the $100 billion that's supposed to come from wealthier countries to lesser developed countries. First thing is, we saw well over $100 billion in clean energy investment in just these 55 emerging market countries last year. So I only throw that out there in the context of the discussion about what supposedly needs to transfer from north to south. There's a lot of money already going on into emerging markets anyway, just in clean energy, and that's not talking about some of the other climate-related things that need to take place. The second point I guess I would make is that that's happening, and Carrie mentioned this earlier, that's happening not necessarily because of altruistic reasons. It's happening because it makes sense. Some of these countries have some of the highest price electricity in the world. So in other words, the bar is pretty low in terms of what clean energy has to beat on a cost basis. If you have, I pay 9 or 10 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity in Northern Virginia, but in some countries they're paying 50 cents or $1 or more per kilowatt hour. And when you have rates that high, it's just not that hard to beat that if you can come in with a solar panel that's reasonably priced and offers that opportunity. So, we're seeing in more and more parts of the world, this stuff is becoming economically competitive. It's because there's high prices locally. It's also because the price of the equipment has dropped so dramatically in the last several years that it's completely changing the game. So it's a very, I try to end on a very optimistic note, which is that the opportunities are there, and we don't have to rely on sort of the goodness of people's hearts to do this. The private sector sees the opportunity to earn returns because it's economically competitive at this point. So thanks very much for your time.
I'd like to call on Mr. Mike Eckert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice presentation, Ethan. Ethan was right. We've known each other for well over 10 years and have been working together, frankly, all around the world. No slides, but I'll make a commentary very similar to Ethan's from a global perspective. But what I'll try to do in each country is point out what the Wilson Center should be working on. I think that's why we're here in the room, is what should you be working on and what's next. First, let me say, though, that a little bit about Citi. If you don't know our institution, most people only know us for our U.S. presence. 70% of our people and assets are outside the U.S. It's a $2 trillion institution that actually doesn't really state actually how big we are. We're in 160 countries. We are by far the World Bank of the world in the commercial sense. We actually have offices in 100 countries. And if you can imagine what it takes in today's very dangerous world to be doing financial transactions in 160 countries, we have quite a sophisticated overhead operation guarding the security of everything we do. And the numbers are quite astonishing, really. Another number, which I still can't get over, is we have a little division that doesn't do any lending. It's not Citibank, it's not corporate banking, it's not capital markets. It just does transaction services for our roughly 32,000 corporate clients around the world in those 160 countries. And this one division moves $3 trillion a day. Can you imagine that? I can't quite get my head around that one. That's a big number. So that's what your global banking institutions are doing today. JP Morgan, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, other big American banks have their own profile. The profile of Citi is global. That's why we are here today. That's actually why Citi in our Washington government budget actually is a corporate supporter of the Wilson Center. And so when I sent the word out that I've been asked to do this, the answer came back very enthusiastic. Yes, please, we're a supporter of that center. They do great work. So I'm very pleased to be here. Now, as it says in the bio, I've been in this probably longer than anybody, since 1976, and spent the first 4 years at Booz Allen. Won a wonderful contract for the Carter White House that apparently I learned after the fact was actually ordered by President Carter, and the studies were done for him. And there were rifle shot studies on all the new energy technologies: wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, all the renewables, cogen, fuel cell, storage, coal gasification, liquefaction, oil shale, advanced nuclear, all of them in a 3 or 4 year period of time. So that was a great base, and I guess we're all still working on whatever we learned in our 20s. But the perspective I'd like to give you, and it's consistent with Ethan's, is that in my view, we're 40 years into a 100-year transition to a clean energy economy. 40 years into a 100-year transition, ballparking it. And when you're 40 years into a 100-year transition, you're in the vertical part of the S-curve. You know, everything goes in S-curves. It goes slow, and then it goes fast, and then it slows down again and matures. Well, we're in the vertical part of the S-curve. Those statistics don't quite show that because they are a limited set. They don't include nuclear. They don't include large hydro. There's a bunch of other things it doesn't include that are also being invested in. And also, they need to be adjusted, Ethan, I'll make this suggestion, for the cost reduction equivalency. So, you know, we have current and constant dollars. I think we should have current and constant costs, so that if costs had not come down, what would those numbers look like? And then you would see the growth. Because the decline in the last few years is really because the cost came down so sharply, because those were the years that China entered the world manufacturing and brought those costs down. So that offsets the revenue growth. So we are in the boom period. This is what I call success. So if you think life is tough today, it was much tougher before, and these are the good old days. Okay, this is where we have lots of little problems, but we're not fully stopped, and we're not fully successful. We're in the mainstream of building an industry. And what we've seen over these 4 years, or 40 years, is 4 big waves of innovation. And this is something that Wilson Center should be looking at and then extending. Technology innovation has occurred. You know that. It's going to keep going. It's not stopping yesterday. Well, what's the outlook on that? People like yourself maybe can give a view. Even more important for policy is market structure innovation. You know, it began with PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, which said the utilities have to buy power from non-utility sources. That's the big bang of this whole industry worldwide, and now that has now spread in the IPP industry even into the depths of Africa, which we're going to hear about, that one law. So go back to that and see where that has gone. But we also have net metering, the very fundamental that a utility has a monopoly franchise and therefore has an obligation to serve load. With net metering, no longer a monopoly. I have a right to grow a tomato in my yard and not buy it from the grocery store. I have a right to generate electricity now and not buy it from the utility. This is a fundamental restructuring of the utility structure that was put in place globally by the U.S. Federal Power Act in 1935. Fundamental market structuring, and this is a great arena for analysis by the Wilson Center. Where are we going with market structuring? How adaptable is it around the world in faraway places that don't have the legal structure that we have to back it up? Remember, it's all rule of law and structure of law that stands behind these. Very easy to do, very difficult to do PURPA, I should say. Even in the United States, it went to the Supreme Court in 1983 and had to be reaffirmed. 5 years of legal battles over this. Look at the history of that. So how much can we spread the U.S. method of doing business around the world? And lastly, financial or policy innovation. We've had great policy innovation, the renewable portfolio standards, the investment tax credit, production tax credit in Europe, the feed-in tariff. These are policy inventions about people like yourself sitting around having coffee, getting an idea and then carrying it forward and getting it enacted. It just didn't fall on us from the sky. Individual people thought of these ideas, and through my career, it's been a real pleasure to be involved in a lot of those in the U.S. and around the world. Lastly, financial innovation of the four of technology, market policy, and now financial innovation. We on, quote, Wall Street in the financial sector worldwide have been aggressively this decade innovating with intention. We created what's called the YieldCo, which is a nickname for a very common financial engineering practice of separating out development phase assets, new projects in development, very at risk. You could lose all your money, no guarantee it gets done, and that requires a high return given the risk. Versus operating assets, a PV project that's finished, it's in commercial operation, it's generating electricity, it's all said and done. Well, that's very low risk, and that deserves investors that are looking for low risk and they don't demand such a high return. So you separate those and you optimize the investment products for the needs or objectives of the different kinds of investors. This was done in real estate, what's called the REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, where developers spin their finished assets off into REITs. And it's done in the oil and gas business in the form of a master limited partnership, MLP, where oil and gas companies spin out their pipelines and other fixed assets into MLPs. YieldCo is just like an MLP or a REIT, just different tax methods. We've also invented green bonds. Well, actually, they were invented by the World Bank and the IFC. Citi led the generation of the green bond principles, a guideline that's now been adopted globally by over 100 financial institutions. And I was emailing early this morning with the chief economist of the People's Bank of China, the Fed, if you will, of China, who's developing China's green finance regime that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. Again, working with them on the adoption of the green bond principles within the core of the China program. And literally last night was emailing with the Minister of Power of India, who's likewise working with the Minister of Finance of India to adopt the green bond principles in India. So it's gone from the US to Europe to Japan to Australia and everywhere else. Now it's even being adopted in China and India. So this is real financial structuring and innovation, just like policy. Some people sit and have coffee, have an idea, write it up, boom, it happens. And this has been the history of policy and market structuring, development, and now financing in the clean energy sector. Intentional people like yourself and myself and Ethan have come up with all these ideas and turned them into policies and practices. And I think the Wilson Center should be looking at this and documenting how did we get here anyway? Take the 100 things that constitute our current situation, analyze them and say, where did they really come from? There is no history book written on this. It's complete blank. People don't know how we got here. Nobody wrote it up. It just happened so fast. So this is something the Wilson Center can do. Now, globally, and I'll just take a few minutes to walk around the world. Ethan has already given us a great briefing. Japan really was the first significant country to move on renewables with their solar program in the late 1990s. I was there in 96 working with the World Bank and witnessed it happen. And now they have the post-Fukushima solar boom, now doing over 10 gigawatts a year from a standing start of 0 almost in 2009 in reaction to the nuclear accident. But now they've got 2 reactors restarted, and here's a Wilson Center analysis, nuclear versus solar in Japan. This is a great analysis to be done, and I don't see anybody really taking it on. But there's your technology competition head-to-head in an environment that really wants to go both ways and doesn't want to go both ways. And it's really a one-on-one heavyweight fight. It deserves thoughtful policy analysis. Denmark in the late 1990s was the first to move on wind power and came to a screeching halt in the year 2000, complete reversal, just as Germany kicked in with its pro-wind policy and later PV and all renewables with the feed-in tariff. But there the thing to analyze is, what do we do in a mature market? Do we turn policies on and off like a switch, or is there some maturing behavior of government as these new technologies achieve great penetration in the market, creating a bit of engineering? I'm an electrical engineer. Believe me, the only thing that utilities have to do to adapt to this high penetration and grid integration is do some work. That's what they need to do. They just need to do some engineering work, that's all. So they're complaining in the policy world, but don't let them get away with that. It's just engineering. But what do we do policy-wise? And next came the U.S., of course, and we really got going in the Energy Policy Acts of 2005, 7, 8, 9, and then the Clean Power Program of 2014 and 15. And here the analysis here that you might address that would be applicable, say, to Africa and Latin America, where it's struggling, is regional differences. I mean, we're adding renewables en masse in the West, but in the Southeast, our utilities in the Southeast United States are still in a rate-based world, thinking that these are fully integrated utilities, working on a return on a rate base, living in the past. They may prove they're right in the future, but the rest of the world seems to be moving on into electricity markets, not rate-based returns. It's 2 different models. And yet right in the U.S., we have full implementation of both of these models here 35 years after PURPA was passed. We have a whole sector of our utility industry not adapting to that, and you see some of that behavior also in Europe. And I fear, as a financier, that's to their demise in the end, not moving with the changes in the market as the market changes. But there's a point of analysis of regional differences, and you can see that in Africa as well. In China, it really started with the Renewable Energy Law. Renewable Energy Law of 2006, we've got the big boom. And there you've got the 5-year plans by the state council, but behind that is the 100-year plan of the party, which was to build their economy based on dirty coal and don't worry about it, and then use their wealth to clean it up. And you see them making that shift right now. That was their plan. I knew that 10 years ago, and they're coming right down the pike on that plan. Track them and watch this large-scale management of their economy, energy, and so on. India, I've got to wrap up here pretty quick, just a couple of topical points. India, the whole issue is financing. The government can pronounce 175 gigawatts of wind and solar, but where's the $175 billion to back that up and the financing? They have a very financially weak utility sector. We at Citi are working with the Minister of Power and Finance on that and refinancing of the utility sector in order to stabilize it and strengthen it. But there you've got a big economy with lots of rule of law and so forth, but financially stressed. And with financial stress, you can't bring on these investments. Then in Latin America and Africa, I would say here the issue is creating policy in countries too small to implement big markets. And it takes big markets to attract the private sector. Therefore, it has to be adopted on a regional basis, not a country-by-country basis. It's like the U.S., we have state by state, but we also have a national environment. And I would suggest the Wilson Center look at Latin America and Africa from a total continental, regional, sub-regional, multi-regional basis, and not worry about, what is Nicaragua going to do, and what is Brazil doing, and what is Chile doing, and We're just not going to attract the private sector's interest doing that. It's just going to always be stuck in not quite there, sputtering. So that just gives you a sense. I'm trying to translate some of Ethan's observations into what can you do about it, and my answer is there's a lot you can do about it. We're not even done. We're 40 years into 100 years. We got 60 years to go. And believe me, the energy markets are driven by public policy. Don't deny that. I do agree with Ethan's comment that things are becoming more economically driven, but they're not economically driven quite yet. They are policy driven, and then within the policy framework, then you turn to how economic is something, but it starts with policy. And I would say, personal observation, I have never seen a country really move ahead on renewable energy until after it has made a full-blown commitment to address climate change. You go back in every big market that has happened, what was the policy regime that caused the capital to be invested? And it was belief in that country had made a commitment, Europe, the US, Japan, Denmark, even China there, that there was a commitment to address climate, and then renewable energy becomes the #1 implementing solution to that policy commitment. So I would put that forward. That as you analyze the policies I've been talking about, keep in mind we are a policy-driven marketplace. Policy comes first, the financing comes second. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's a lot of work for the Woodrow Wilson that Mr. Eckhart has suggested. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, and thanks very much for the Wilson Center for having me. I'm Jake Cusack. I'm the managing partner at Cross Boundary Energy. I have some slides that I'm going to go through quite quickly. I know it's a diverse audience and not necessarily as interested in sort of solar energy in East Africa as I am in particular. But I do want to dive down, I think, from some of the bigger picture points that have been made to a little bit of some of the tactical implementation points of how renewable energies are coming into these developing and frontier markets. And then some broader implications on that for policy and political considerations. Is there a clicker? Is this it? Okay, so Cross Boundary Energy was really born out of our advisory business. We had an advisory business working in frontier markets and investment for some time. And in doing so, we noticed that the two largest problems for African SMEs, which are one of the main groups that we were working with, is access to reliable electricity and access to finance. So in terms of access to reliable electricity, not only is electricity quite expensive in many parts of Africa, for instance, in Liberia, probably the highest price throughout all of Africa, around 55 cents grid price, which is actually more than you would pay if you ran a diesel generator the entire time. But access to finance, and there's reliability difficulties as well, which is a major problem for manufacturing. And then access to finance is a challenge. And I'll talk about why this access to finance challenge is very relevant to solar adoption in these markets. So solar, the nature of solar is that it requires a very large upfront investment. Most of solar is that initial, say, $2 million investment you make to get a megawatt of solar. And that investment then pays for itself by providing you very cheap energy over the next 25 years. But a challenge for businesses is that initial upfront investment. And you can compare that to diesel generation. Diesel generators are cheaper, but then you spend a lot on fuel. In terms of fuel, you might be spending about 30 cents per kilowatt hour, and then you have to replace the generators periodically, but your upfront expenditure is much less. That means that solar is largely a financing challenge, adoption of solar. This was solved in the US by companies like SolarCity and SunEdison by providing the financing to install solar for free on people's homes or at commercial businesses, and then simply continuing to pay, that customer would continue to pay their power bill and pay off that system over time. But this model did not yet exist in Africa for African businesses, and so we raised $8.5 million of equity to do about $25 million of sort of pilot projects targeting this space. So this is the solution that we built. Our firm's Cross Boundary Energy. We teamed up with another firm, NVI Energy, to build a platform called Solar Africa. This platform has sort of different value propositions depending on who you are. For the power users, for that African business, whether it's a Coca-Cola bottler, a safari lodge, a shopping mall, a hotel, and these can be off or on-grid customers, we offer them the ability to shift to cheaper, cleaner solar energy, and to do that in a full service way where they don't have to bear any of that upfront cost, and they don't take any technical risk. They don't have to take the bet that solar works. Solar is often a mistrusted technology in these markets, but they only pay for power that's actually produced and consumed. They pay by the kilowatt hour instead of making that upfront $2 million investment. For the technical contractors that we partner with, we allow them now to do these sort of sales, not sell up front, but instead sell these fully financed solar as a service solution. And for our investors, and yieldcos were mentioned, investors who are interested in entering Africa, one of the traditional challenges is it's a tough market to enter because you're not sure what your exit is going to be. You might come in and make a $5 million investment in African business, but because the capital markets, the stock markets are not there to sort of exit to, it's really a nascent ecosystem of investment. You might end up holding that investment for 5, 10 years and be stuck in a liquid situation where you can't convert your investment into cash, whereas these sort of investments produce reliable, stable cash flows, which are appealing to investors and allow them a point of entry to the African growth story. I talked a little bit about this. Why does solar need financing? It needs financing because that it's so upfront expensive, and also because it's a directly accessible technology, and I'll talk about what I mean by these two things. First of all, as has been talked about, the cost of solar has come down dramatically in the last 10 years, and that's why you've seen the accelerated adoption across these markets. When you look at the levelized cost of solar, if say on a 25-year horizon, you might say it's around 10 cents. There's been PPAs signed in places like Dubai for 6 cents due to exceptionally cheap debt. But that cost of energy is cheaper than the grid prices in many of these African countries, and definitely cheaper than diesel generation. So what you have is this fundamental change in the nature of energy. Before, utilities sort of sold power in one direction, and you either hooked up to the grid and had power, or you didn't have power. Now these businesses have a choice to generate some or all of their own power, and this is changing the dynamics in these markets. Solar is an interesting technology because it doesn't get that much cheaper if you install it in huge amounts. At a certain point, say close to a megawatt, it's about as cheap to install a megawatt of solar, or it's about the same cost as it is a significantly larger installation. So both of these, the new way and the old way, are producing the same product, which is kilowatt hours, but it's very different because now it's something that you can put directly on your roof, and you have a vote in where your energy supply is coming from. And this is just simply reinforcing the point that this is a localized solution often. This is on your roof. This is a picture during construction of the Garden City project, which I'll talk about shortly. Why do we find this business model innovation? And I think one thing that's important to emphasize is we're not doing anything technically new here. Solar is more than proven, widely adopted in the U.S. and other markets, but ironically not that adopted in Africa, which actually has very high quality solar radiation, so the quality of the resource is quite high, and competes with very expensive grid prices. So it's quite ironic that due to sort of public policy, Germany has significantly more solar energy than Africa, which actually has much better sun hour resource in Africa. So why do we think this business model innovation is important, is allowing customers to make an easy choice, and we're sort of in the early adopter part of the curve in Africa, to make an easy choice to adopt solar and make it just as easy for them as it is to rent a diesel generator, which has been the traditional way these businesses deal with their power problems. This is illustrated in one of our agreements, what's called the power purchase agreement, which is familiar to all those in the energy space. But as opposed to paying $2 million for solar up front, we offer these businesses the opportunity to just continue paying, say, 20 cents a kilowatt hour on a 10-year contract and have cheaper, cleaner power that way. This is a bit technical. I don't go into this detail. I do want to make the point, because oftentimes, especially in Africa, people associate solar with purely off-grid solutions, solar in conjunction with battery, or simply solar power that's provided during the day to rural households. We're doing quite a bit of solar actually in conjunction with the grid as well, which is common in the U.S. In the U.S., it relies more on net metering. There's not net metering policies in most African, or in any really African countries at this point yet. So we're simply, and this is an example of that sort of curve, the gray area indicating the typical load, and then as the sun rises, you have power coming from your solar that's replacing the power that's coming from the grid, complementing the power that's coming from the grid, and should be cheaper than the power that's coming from the grid. So it's an economic case for these businesses to switch over. And this is an example of a project that we recently completed in Nairobi, the largest solar system ever built in Nairobi, almost 1 megawatt of rooftop solar done in a carport structure at a shopping mall and residential development in Nairobi. This is so fully financed by us. We're selling power to this mixed-use development on a 12-year contract. It's also the first development of its type in East Africa to be able to get LEED certification, and it was enabled to do that through the solar energy. This is a picture of during the installation, but near completion of the facility. As you can see, it's the roof of essentially the shopping mall, and then cars can park underneath and benefit from the shade of the panels, and the panels are producing about 40 to 50% of the total complex's daily power requirement. So to make, I guess, a couple broader points about how this can apply outside of East Africa. The first is that this is a very wide space. There's a lot of different things going on here in terms of innovation in Africa. So Haim and I were at dinner last week with the team from Off-Grid Electric. Off-Grid Electric just raised $25 million in Series C venture capital financing to continue their household systems, which they're doing in Tanzania and Rwanda. They have already been, SolarCity's already invested in them. The venture capital firm that just came in has previously invested in Tesla and SolarCity, and so sees the potential for innovation in this household solar space, which is actually a very different space than what we're doing. So the average size of these systems that they're doing are between, say, 10 and 50 watts, which is quite small solar systems, really just enough to power your cell phone, power a light, perhaps power a television. It doesn't necessarily represent all of the sort of consumption goods that we would associate with the middle class. Another prominent startup in this space that's been doing very well is M-Copa. People have probably heard of D-Light, Solaric in Bangladesh. And this is solving the problem of homes that previously were having to burn kerosene to have light and trek a mile to go charge their cell phone to be able to do those things at home through an inexpensive product. So that's, these systems are sort of maybe in the 50 watt space. The smallest system that we would do, say for an off-grid safari lodge, might be 50 kilowatt peak, which is 1,000 times larger than that system. And then in turn, for example, Haim's system is then again a utility scale system selling power into the Rwandan grid, 1,000 times larger than the smallest system we would do. On our upper end, we do go up to 5 megawatt solar systems. So you have these very small solar home systems, tens of thousands of customers. I think Off-Grid Electric is adding 10,000 new customers per month now. And then you have the commercial space that we're focused in, providing power to African businesses, and then you have the utility scale projects. So I think what's exciting in Africa and generally in these emerging markets right now is they're almost a laboratory for innovation. And the grid and the type of energy markets that are evolving there are very different than those that we already have in the developed world, and in some sense are leapfrogging some of the traditional ways that people thought about providing energy. So we think that the future of Africa is a much more decentralized grid where you have these distributed technologies working in tandem and sometimes independently from the robust baseload power production that has been the traditional model. There are some implications, we think, for politics and policy here in terms of these choices in energy sources allow for more accountability, allow people to have a vote in energy. It's very interesting. I'm sort of a nerd about some of the history stuff, and if you go all the way back to the 1300s, the 1400s, and the invention of the windmill, the precursor to the wind power that we see today, windmills had a powerful decentralizing factor in power because in feudal times you had to bring your grain to get processed at a central point. But windmills allowed this to become more distributed. And we think that there are, obviously not a perfect analogy, but there's implications for the ability for people to make their own choices about energy and exist independently from the monopoly of the typically government utility for politics in these regions. I think another exciting aspect here is the way that USAID and other players through the Power Africa initiative have come aggressively into the space and shown leadership in bringing energy to Africa. Both in terms of policy work and convening work in terms of bringing interested stakeholders together, but also in thinking about new ways to leverage private capital because the dollar amounts that were being talked about earlier cannot come from traditional development aid. They only work if really substantial institutional private capital comes into this space. So Power Africa was very helpful in getting our venture off the ground. I know it was helpful to Heim as well. And I think it is represent a new sort of model of development that we hope is continued in other ways. I think I'll wrap up there. I do think, the other last point here is I think frontier markets and emerging markets are the most exciting place in the world to work right now. And in particular, the energy revolution and this major energy transition that we are in the middle of. And it's been interesting as we've worked in this space for the last couple of years to see the remarkable increase in interest and the increase in money flowing into the space over the last couple of years means that this is one of the most interesting areas to have an impactful career right now. So I think I'll wrap it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'll talk a little bit about the project in Rwanda that I developed and an 8.5 megawatt solar project. I'll give a bit of an overview of the project and through some of the challenges that we faced, some of the different things that we learned. I think there could be some more generalizable learnings. In terms of the project itself, we developed an 8.5 megawatt solar PV project, 25-year power purchase agreement, $23.7 million of financing for it. Largest solar field in Africa outside of South Africa and Mauritius, and fastest from development to completion and interconnection. There were many parties critical for its success. We'll talk about some of them as I continue with the presentation. Why Rwanda? So I started looking at solar projects in sub-Saharan Africa in 2012 and looked at many, many countries. Rwanda had a number of factors that were attractive. Number one, there was a tremendous need. At the time, in 2012, March 2012, Rwanda had 110 megawatts of energy on the grid for a population of 12 million people. That's remarkably little energy. Of that 110 megawatts, about 40% was diesel generated, which is polluting, of course, and also very expensive. So there was a business case, there was a real need. In addition, the government itself, Rwanda is a remarkably good place to do business. There's very little corruption. It's one of the best ranked in Africa in terms of ease of doing business. I was able to set up a company in several hours, and I didn't even have to be there. And I didn't even have to have a local partner in order to do so. I 100% owned the company in literally 3 hours. There's something called the Rwanda Development Board in Rwanda, which is a facilitating organization that was founded. Basically, there were about 7-8 different agencies that help people do business and get business done in Rwanda. It was combined into one group, one government institution called the Rwanda Development Board, which facilitates interactions between investors and various parts of the industry. So instead of having to go to the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, Energy Ministry, there's a facilitating board. It doesn't always work exactly like that, of course, but the fact that there's sort of a one-stop shop, and again, it might not be exactly one-stop, it's not, but it certainly makes things a lot simpler in terms of dealing with government. And I would say that's part of the enabling environment, enabling framework that allowed us to work in Rwanda successfully. Talking about frameworks, there was an existing IPP framework, which was important. We were the first IPP to be built, but the framework existed and one prior IPP had been negotiated. So that was also attractive. Finally, we had a strong local partner on the ground, a youth village that was on the ground. with a person on the ground who could actually get things done. Just a side point about local partners. One of the biggest challenges, I think, and whether you succeed or fail in projects, is who you choose as a local partner. We had, in various countries, I've had many, many people come to me with, a lot of times people are selling access or, kind of whispering, I'm friends with the vice president. That kind of partnership, that's not the kind of partnership that I'm looking for or would look for. And I think, having a strong partner who can get things done and who's ethically strong was really critical as well. Talk about a little bit about the timelines and different decision points and different challenges at different points. We started negotiating. So we came to Rwanda middle to end of 2012, had an MOU with the government. Were asked to do a feasibility study, which we presented on December 28th, 2012. It was a comprehensive feasibility study. It was reviewed. We all worked through Christmas and New Year's. They want to move fast, which we'll get to in a moment, maybe even too fast. By end of January, the feasibility study was reviewed and approved, and we were invited to start negotiating. At that point, we began negotiations with the government. That period was between February 2013 and July 22, 2013. The key point on that, I would say, is that first of all, I brought in a very strong lawyer. We brought in Norton Rose Fulbright, the head of energy for Norton Rose, led the deal, Simon Curry. We chose them based on their skill, but also because they had done the only other deal in Rwanda, so actually had knowledge of the country, and that was a good choice. It was an excellent choice. They were a fantastic legal team, but I would say that it wouldn't have been possible to conclude a deal in the time that we did, again, the first solar power purchase agreement in the region, without having a strong legal team on the side of the government of Rwanda. They had strong legal representation. They had some international help for a team, as well as local Rwandan lawyers, and I think some people might think, I'm sure nobody here, but that it's good if the other side is not a strong legal team because you get a better deal. But in reality, if you don't have a strong legal team on both sides, you're going to end up with either a lopsided deal that no DFI will want to finance, or you'll end up with a bad deal. So it really is important to have strong legal representation on both sides, and I think that was also a very important aspect of putting this deal together. We signed the deal July 22, 2013. Like most developers, we did not have a lot of money. Many developers go out of business as they're trying to develop projects and can't take a project to financial completion. At that point, there was, I guess, two aspects. One, we had some early flexible grants. We got a grant from something called EEP. 3 European countries, Austria, Finland, and the UK, sponsored that grant, and we also got a $400,000 grant from Power Africa. Not a tremendous amount of money, but catalytic and very important at a stage where we hadn't yet financed the deal, but where the deal was moving in the right direction, and it was very helpful, and it was at the right time. I would say in terms of some of these financing structures, there are a number of grants out there. Some of them require a very long lead time in advance of projects, where you really don't know what your project's going to look like when you apply, and could take 6 months, a year to get the proper response. I think when designing these programs, and I think there's a move towards that, and I know that the OPIC ASIF grant is definitely like that. It's flexible, it's fast, they make quick decisions, and it's the right cycle of time. That was especially important in a situation that we had where the government of Rwanda, in our power purchase agreement, had a 6-month deadline within which we had to finance the deal. If we didn't reach financial close within 6 months, later extended to 7, they were generous, the deal would have died, and nobody had financed the deal in that kind of time. It was technically possible, though, I believed, and it was, but it was very, very challenging. It was a testament to their wanting to move quickly, but it also made a lot of things quite difficult in terms of just, I guess, lack of sleep for about a year. They didn't sleep either, so it was kind of, we worked well together, but it was definitely one of the challenges. So in terms of in terms of how do you do a project, how do you get a project done in that kind of period? So how do you get it financed in that kind of period? So I think a couple of things we did. We kept flexibility by having a number of engineering procurement. We did a very strong request for proposals for the engineering side of things so that we wouldn't end up negotiating for a year on every term. We spent a lot of time on the legal and engineering side so that it was very tight so that there's not a lot of terms to negotiate. You either accept or don't accept when you give us your bid. And if the tighter it is, the less hard it is to get to final terms. With the debt, and we had to do due diligence with several debt providers and did parallel due diligence so we wouldn't end up stuck without terms that can work for us and without people who can do the right timelines. With equity, we were fortunate to find good partners, I guess, in the middle of this piece, and that was really critical. So the partners that we actually ended up working with, FMO, and Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund for debt. We made a lot of practical choices, I would say. We didn't always go with the necessarily, it's a whole package of who can actually get it done. And FMO and EIF were fantastic partners. They were able to get it done. They were also the previous debtors in Rwanda together. They had worked together in Rwanda. They had done the one prior deal in Rwanda. So it was a good choice. For equity and for mezzanine debt, we had Norfund, the Norwegian Government Development Fund. And for equity, we had Norfund, the largest pension fund in Norway, KLP, as well as Scatec Solar, who was also the lead investor and also the engineering procurement construction company, a Norwegian group, a Norwegian equity team that had also had worked together, were familiar with each other and trusted each other. And I would say this last point in terms of the choices we made them also based on who we trusted and who we thought could get it done. We weren't trying to maximize for every single aspect. I think if we had, we wouldn't have done it on time. We might have built a less good solar field. And I think those choices were very important in that aspect. One other aspect, as we were trying to finance the deal, which was important, taxes, not necessarily the most exciting topic for most people. But if we didn't get that right, the deal would not have worked. We went to all the experts in the country. Everybody gave us different advice and realized that if we didn't get clarification, we'd end up potentially battling tax authorities for the next 20 years. And we ended up, a little more stories to that, but we ended up getting a tax determination and judgment on interpretation. We were the first company to do so on a lot of very ambiguous issues. And I think when defining policy for any country, that's important. That's something which can be pre-done. We had to do it ourselves, really, but that's something that should be done in any framework environment so that investors know what they're getting into and that there's less ambiguity and less problems moving forward. I'll just show a couple of pictures quickly. Thank you. The surrogate has stopped working. You'll take my word for it. Great. So it's our signing of the PPA. Do I just press here? Some photographs during construction. Again, construction was done by our partner Scatec Solar, and we really chose well and partnered well, and they're also a key equity investor. This is the ribbon cutting. This is a solar field from above. That's the youth village. This is in the shape of Africa, 28,360 panels. And I guess there's no last photographs. There are a couple of other photographs. We started getting a lot of visitors. Bono came a couple of weeks ago. We've been quite fun over the last couple of months. But at any rate, I think I hope to be involved, and we hope to be involved in future projects in the continent. I think a lot of what Rwanda did right, and a lot of the choices made, I think, are applicable to other countries and other solar projects in the continent, and happy to answer further questions.
Excellent. Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to ask one question from either you or Haim. Do you think that this grid connection, we can do away with getting the electricity through the grid, and can we have just off-grid electricity
So I don't-
now?
I think it's both at this point.
You
I-
can't do away with it. I mean, one can't, because in a country like, say, Afghanistan or Pakistan,
Yeah.
areas which are very remote, and also which need modest amounts of electricity,
Yeah.
and getting to the grid getting the grid to those areas is very difficult. So forever they'll remain without electricity. So in that
Sure.
case,
So I think yes and yes and yes. I think Jake spoke about some of the different types of models that we're seeing. We're seeing small systems, we're seeing larger systems for home, we're seeing mini grids, and we're seeing utility scale projects. I think all of them have a
All-
place. I think in more remote areas, as you said, there are different models. I think with some of the innovations right now, I think we will move, and potentially, there is room to have less grid connected focus and less infrastructure than we built up in America. But I think all are parts of the solution. I think the answer is yes, yes, and yes.
okay.
So I just to quickly comment. So I think in Kenya, 70% of the population that doesn't have electricity is within 600 meters of a grid line. So often grid extension can be a more economic way to provide a robust electricity. It's still quite expensive compared to simply buying a solar home system that can charge your cell phone. But grid extension is definitely, I think, part of the story here. The important variable in terms of how autonomous and how standalone these systems become is the price of storage. So batteries prices have been coming down. I think the recent announcements from Tesla with their Powerwall is between $250 and $350 per kilowatt hour of storage. This is still quite expensive. It means, in a U.S. home, you're spending, over $30,000 to get, if you wanted to sort of disconnect yourself from the grid, at least that much. But storage will continue to come down. And I think it's important to note that, solar is a technology, not a fuel, which is why that you've seen such a dramatic reduction in cost. And there's certainly room for storage prices to continue to come down. So I think it's going to be, a hybrid of all these technologies. You'll have very remote areas where you have, some of these very small off-grid systems that simply provide power for a cell phone and lighting. But for most people, it will be a combination of mini grids, grid extension, and the main grid itself.
Thank you. Yes, Mike?
Just go on somewhere. Is it on?
Yeah,
It's not working.
Automatically on? Yeah, I would say, to coin a phrase, that the days of grid extension or nothing are over.
Okay.
That's the key thing. And I think it's the combination of the technology advancement and cost reduction on the one hand, and the very extensive and sophisticated work of the aid agencies like USAID and so many others that are coming together to address the off-grid needs in a productive way, not trying to find no answer. Because I think also I would say the days of no idea are over. There is an idea for a solar home system, or even smaller than that, a D-light light.
Right.
And I have all those lights on my patio at home, and we use them, and you can buy them from Amazon. All the way to a solar home system, to a microgrid, to a mini grid, as you were saying, all the way up. And then you can think of pre-grid extension, of establishing a mini grid, microgrid ahead of the transmission line, getting there in 5 or 10 years. But the promise of the transmission line no longer should stop the immediate development of the off-grid solution. And we have them in hand. So the era of no ideas is over. And we have good ideas.
So, okay, I'd like...
Could I raise one more thing?
Yes, yes, please.
No country in this world, to the work of the Wilson Center, the fatal flaw right now is no country in this world has a public policy for off-grid, as every country in the world does have for grid. Not one country has written a law that says off-grid electricity policy. And there needs to be a model. I see some heads nodding. This is urgent. I was doing off-grid solar in 1997 in Africa and India, almost 20 years ago. And we sensed at the time, we can't succeed. There's no policy to support what we're doing. And I'm shocked to see that even today, not one country in this world has a law called off-grid electricity policy. And I would urge the Wilson Center to come forward with something.
More work,
lot of homework.
more work for Wilson Center.
A lot of homework assignments.
Yes, please. I think, yes, you at the end, the last. There's microphones. We'll take 2 questions at a time. You next.
Okay. So just listening to this step-by-step process of bring this work to fruition with tax and having lawyers negotiating the deal, it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities, or I should say a lot of potential for things to kind of just fall and collapse completely. But listening to it, there's like a lot of promise too. So the question is there? Do you see, or what is the biggest opportunity that you see? I mean, there's so many. I'm thinking of efficiency, but there's so many little pieces to your puzzle that, particularly listening to Jake and Chaim talk. Is there one aspect that is like the biggest opportunity that people are missing out on?
May I ask you to introduce yourself as well, please?
Chad Lipton from National Geographic.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Saaf Fili from Sierra Leone, West Africa, a student of DeVry, background in IT and telecom. My question goes to the second speaker on my left. First and foremost, I wish to thank President Obama for initiating the Power Africa so that every African village and every African student could have the opportunity to read at night. My question to the second, is it possible that we have Power IT and Telecommunication Africa, as what President Obama did at Power Africa? Because the IT and telecommunication infrastructure in Africa is poor. I'm here, I want to call my family back in Africa. The card I use, the $2 card I use, instead of 10 minutes, it's 3 minutes, simply because the T1 and the collocation, we don't have it. The entire 54 countries with 1.3 billion people within Africa don't have a data center. So is it possible that we have renewable energy? Now let's have sustainable IT and telecommunication. Agitator, this is my question for the second speaker.
The question is to? Mr. Eckert?
Like
Okay, Mr. Eckert. Okay, the first, but can we take 2 questions at a time, please? That question was to Jake, the first question, the big opportunities.
Yeah, so I think in terms of big opportunities, those are still in the future. I think, and one of the challenges and the reason that there's a need for development dollars in this space is that these are new, shallow markets. So one of the challenges that we face in each country that we enter is there's a certain fixed cost of entry, as Chaim was alluding to. So before you set up in a country, you have to figure out the tax regime, you have to figure out the regulatory regime, you have to have confidence that the regulator is not going to come in later and interfere with existing power generation operations that you've set up. This all incurs expense, and by nature, financing power projects is a very legally intensive process. So, similar to Chaim with Norton Rose, we've really benefited from the help of Chad Bourne, who's been very helpful to us in this process in reducing and deferring some of their fees in order for us to reach completion. We similarly benefited from an OPIC ASIF grant that covered legal costs before the private investors came in. And this is a very catalytic way to use development dollars because we're getting multiples of 10 to 20 times in terms of the private capital brought in for an aid dollar spent. But that's a challenge in Africa generally, is you have fragmented markets, different rules in each one. So when we're looking at, say, like a market like Liberia, 4 million people, somewhat limited in terms of its existing commercial enterprises, and until recently, at least, an environment of regulatory uncertainty. They recently passed a new electricity bill. These countries are sort of competing with each other to be the next investment destination. So the ones that are more welcoming from a regulatory perspective, or where there's the benefit of aid or development to help ease that cost of market entry, I think are quite appealing. Just quickly on the telecoms point, I think actually telecoms has been largely a success story in Africa. Basically every African conference you go to, somebody's going to use the word leapfrog and telecoms in the same sentence talking about how mobile phones there have come into everyone's hands across the country without really much fixed line infrastructure being built up. So I think in some ways, if we see a similar thing happen with energy, that would be a success story as well.
And maybe just one point in terms of the telecom. There's actually there's actually a strong connection with the mobile money out of the telecom industry and the ability of solar to penetrate all over the continent, especially in rural areas. I'm not sure if most of you may be familiar with M-Pesa, which started about 8 years ago, I think. Really very recent, and basically allows people to send money anywhere in the country. In the past, you'd have to give somebody money and hope that it gets to your village intact, paying a lot of money lost and very inefficient. Kenya, it flourished, and Kenya is also where I think the payments for solar systems. Well, maybe I take a step back. The payments for solar systems, for a lot of these small solar systems, are done by mobile money and mobile payments. And the innovations in mobile money, as well as the reduced cost of solar, I think combined are what allows the rural villages, many people in the rural areas, to get the solar energy that they need, or the energy that they need.
I would just add on to just to put even a little more detail around that for anybody who's not aware of these so-called pay-as-you-go systems, which I think are some of the most interesting, really intriguing things, which is that the way these work is that you essentially are handed a battery, a small solar module, and the battery has various outlets that you can use to charge your phone or to run a few lights, and it often will also have a little keypad on it, and the person who takes that into their possession doesn't pay for the whole thing up front. They go on a so-called pay-as-you-go system, and essentially they'll put some money down at the start typically, and then over time, as they want to operate that, they'll essentially buy a certain number of hours through mobile money, as you mentioned. They'll pay over mobile money. They'll get sent back a code on their phone. They punch the code into the box, and they get a fixed number of additional hours using the system. And that way, the provider of the system gets paid off over time. The user of the system doesn't have to put up all the money at once. I mean, these systems we're not talking more than $100 or $200 often, but that's a lot of money, obviously, for someone in some of these communities. And that's the so-called pay-as-you-go system. So the intertwining between telecom and that off-grid solar is enormous. And these two things are fundamental. Partly one of the reasons why people want to get these systems is so that they can, in turn, charge their own phone instead of walking a few miles and spending, an exorbitant amount of money to charge their phone, to some local vendor. So the two are totally intertwined at this point.
Yes, Mr. Eckert.
Yeah, to the question on comparison to telecom, there's a misperception, I believe, that somehow off-grid electricity is a parallel, just like cell phones, wireless, and they're not comparable whatsoever in my view. There are really three levels there's two levels of telecom, not one of which is completely off-grid. There's the monopoly wired telecom, that's the old one, but the cell phone system is not entrepreneurial. It is actually a multi-supplier, centrally regulated system. The cell phone supplier, service suppliers are regulated by government, just like the wired utility was regulated by government. They're given a spectrum of frequency that they can operate in, and they are heavily regulated as to customer service and so on. They're free to compete, but that's not the same as what we have in PV, which is off-grid. With off-grid PV and other electricity, there is no central entity to regulate. That's the difference. It is entrepreneurial. Nobody's issued a level of spectrum that they can operate, or any equivalency like that. It is and so what I would suggest is the model for the public policy to have a scaled up, very successful off-grid global implementation of off-grid PV and other renewables is a public policy centered on consumer protection. That's what's missing in my view. There can be a very simple agency that A, certifies the equipment that's allowed to be sold in that country or in that region. Secondly, the regulation of services, that the installations have to be done at a quality level and they're spot monitored and so forth. And third, backup for financing. It can be a credit enhanced financing program that making capital available to off-grid, but in a fairly managed and controlled way. But I'm just suggesting that if you want to develop a model policy for off-grid national policy regulation or policy encouragement, it would be focused on consumer protection to make sure it's a successful market expansion.
If I could just add
we'll
one
take-
quick thing to that,
Okay.
which and Mike next point's very good about the point of needing proactive development of off-grid policies. And I would just say that that and all that stuff on the consumer protection side makes a lot of sense. And by the way, the IFC actually has certification for certain levels of equipment, so that's a standard that could be adopted
That's right.
at a national level already. But on the flip side, to your initial point, Mike, which I really agree with, which is that basically when you head into a country and you try and get into a new nation, you discover, well, there's a tax problem over here, there might be a zoning issue over here. There are a lot of different legal challenges to the companies trying to do this that are spread across multiple agencies. And so to Mike's basic point, which I really agree with, is that if someone would proactively within a country try to identify all of these across the multiple agencies and form one policy and bring people together. Because honestly, it's not always just as simple. With telecom, it was like, okay, you deal with the telecom folks and we have a telecom policy. When it comes to this kind of off-grid activity, it affects multiple regulatory agencies and challenges. And we talk a lot about the money, but the money's part of the issue here. But the kind of getting the rules right on the ground is a major issue still that will prevent this from happening.
I think though there has to be a balance, because the institutions have to be strong enough to effectively implement the policy. Because I completely agree with you, but there are certain countries where the institutions are not strong enough to effectively implement that policy, and it would actually be worse than a light touch. In other words, it would be worse to have to get a license and be held to certain standards if the process of getting that license is very susceptible to corruption and takes years. You know, some of these markets have sort of taken off in spite of themselves because there's a little bit of blank space to come in. So it depends a little bit, I think, on the country. And then on the telecoms point, I think the only sort of the way the analogy works to the mobile phones is that you are going to see a very different infrastructure emerge without sort of intermediate infrastructure coming into place, which was the story of mobile phones. They never built out the fixed line infrastructure.
I think we'll take 2 more questions now. Yes, please. This man in pink sweater.
Yes, good morning. A very interesting presentation. I'm very interested in renewables.
Please, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Alejandro Lara. I'm pursuing studies at Georgetown. I have a question. Actually, it's a comment and a specific question. First of all, I would like to hear a word about storage and if any investments targeting specifically on that. Also, I've been hearing, lately that pretty much the renewable energy is been spinning. If you get that feeling, it's been spinning for a while, but it does not get traction for some reason. Perhaps the reason is that most of the investments are concentrated or targeting where obviously it's more of a return, right, rather than efficiency. Meaning that I would like to hear, when a decision is made, when is that decision made? I mean, to what extent it's targeting efficiency rather than investment for sake. Perhaps, rather than investing on non-renewables, a decision will be better made investing in renewables. So I would like to hear something about that. Thank you.
Okay, can we?
Hello, my name is Matt Austin with the Office of Private Capital and Microenterprise at USAID. This question is for Mike. Many have seen the YieldCo model as a great vehicle for driving private capital to renewable energy and the energy sector more broadly, including in emerging markets. Over the last few months, the YieldCos have run into some challenges and are getting there's increasing criticism and skepticism on the model, and I'm interested in your take on the current state of the YieldCo model and the prospects going forward.
Let's take one more question here.
My name is Julio Guiti from Sudek Inc. My question is for Michael particularly. Perhaps the rest of you can comment on it, but it has to do with the Green Fund. How is your engagement in the Green Fund? What are the financial instruments that are being created, and to what extent these developing countries can have access? I'm mostly talking about a small island in the Caribbean that very often, because of the weak institutions, they have access to concessional financing most of the time. And if you can please share your thoughts about some cases in the Caribbean, how you have been working with Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you. Would like to take the first question? Anybody? About storage and renewable energy investment.
I'll take a quick crack at it. First of all, I mean, on the Jake touched on this earlier, which is that for all intents and purposes, the sort of the dream that some might have to completely get off the grid and be completely energy independent with a battery in your house is a dream that only a multimillionaire might pursue if they are willing to spend $20,000 or $30,000 to buy 2, 3, or 4 Tesla Powerwalls and put them up in their garage. On the off chance that there might be a hurricane that knocks down the grid entirely. It is not currently feasible for residential use. On the small commercial space, on the other hand, we are seeing some interesting opportunities already around power storage, in part because of the way tariffs are assessed in some markets already. Not so that a business can get 100% off the grid, but so that when prices are at their highest, they can use for even an hour or two, battery power, as opposed to buying it from the grid at an extraordinarily high price. So there are opportunities around that right now. In terms of the pricing, Jake mentioned, some of the prices that Tesla has quoted. Prices are coming down very quickly, and the sort of trend that we saw in photovoltaics, which was that the Chinese jumped in, scaled the market very, very quickly, and prices plummeted. That same movie we're starting to see again around power storage, and also because it's being driven by Tesla, which is building one of the largest lithium-ion battery factory the world's ever known. So the trends toward lower price power storage are here. We're seeing them happening, but in most cases, it's not viable in a sort of residential sphere. So I think we'll see a lot more. I guess to your second question, I'm not sure I entirely understood it, except for to say that I think there's a lot of traction in this market at this point. I mean, in terms of renewables, the dollar amounts certainly have leveled at about $300 billion, but as Mike notes, the gigawatt numbers, the capacity numbers continue to rise year on year. So I think we're seeing a lot. And in terms of the activity, like I was saying earlier, by our measure of these Climatescope countries, these 55 emerging markets, there was actually a little bit more capacity deployed in those countries than there were in OECD countries. So the trend is definitely moving in that direction. The question is, can it continue? Will there be enough money going forward? Will these regulatory issues get sorted? And then there just literally is an infrastructure issue, which is, how many Jakes and Hyams can we get out there to actually do this kind of stuff? I mean, you actually need people to go and develop projects. I think the point that someone raised earlier, I was sort of saying, well, this sounds really hard. Well, yeah, project development is hard. It's hard work. It's challenging. But in some ways, I find what these guys are doing really exciting because, 2 years to do a solar project, I mean, that's pretty incredible. I mean, Mike was developing, you've been developing projects, decades ago you were doing projects, and I'm sure you've got the battle scars to show how hard it can be to build something. So to get something built in a couple of years in an emerging market, it's really remarkable, and it's very positive.
I just add one word. Thank you, Ethan, for that. I guess in terms of, I see that there is traction. That's my impression. I know when we started, it was the first on grid in the region. I believe there will be a number of others coming up. Right now, we're the largest, like I said, in Sub-Saharan Africa outside of South Africa and Mauritius. I expect that we won't be the largest for very long, and I think that's a good thing. And I see a lot of opportunity.
Quick on the storage. My own view is that if you imagine a solar project in the middle of Virginia with a transmission line to this building, and it had a storage system to help it deliver the electricity when PEPCO wanted it, how many days a year is that relevant to PEPCO? 365? No, about 20 days a year in the summer. So that battery is going to get paid for 20 days a year. As compared to put the same battery in the basement of this building, starting to create a microgrid, the building becomes its own microgrid. How many days a year will the battery be used? Every day. All right, so it's the functionality of the storage is the key question. And from an engineering point of view, where would you put it and who's paying for it? Every day or 20 days a year or that. So it's a very sophisticated thing in terms of electrical engineering and electrical economics. But that basic thing of, do you want it out there or do you want it in the basement? I think we want it in the basement to support the load, not make the solar project look more attractive. That's the best economics. Then on the question of YieldCo, there's a lot of discussion of that. It's a very active discussion in the capital markets, the equity markets today, what's with the YieldCos. And I'll just give my own view that we had a big run-up. Well, the YieldCo is only a year old. The first one was 2 years ago by NRG in July of 2013, and then there was a lot of them that went about a year ago. So the bulk of it is only about a year old, which means we're all learning what is the marketability of these shares and how are valuations being done. So it's still young. And with that in mind, as the many YieldCo issuance IPOs came out, there was a kind of a rush to every major investor wanted to have some shares in the YieldCo to get the experience. So there was an overbuying, you might say. So prices, I won't say a bubble, but it drove prices up maybe more than anticipated or expected. And then we had three things happen in the summer. First, there was a 1,000-point on the Dow overall correction in the stock market. There was a correction, as they call it, in July. And the same time, we had the thought sinking in that maybe oil prices were going to stay down. So even within that correction, energy stocks went down even more as investors readjusted their exposure to energy stocks, and that affected YieldCos, as YieldCos are energy stocks, not oil, but still energy stocks. And then third, there was this post-exuberant rethinking of how much exposure do I want to a YieldCo? Do I like the model? And so there was some negative readjustment of portfolios on that. So you had the overall market, the energy market, and the YieldCo all happening in July and August. So share prices took quite a dive. And now we've had, in the last 2 months, a bit of a correction to that. So I think we had an overbuy, an oversell, and now a readjustment. And in the sense of that, a lot of rethinking, honestly, from the YieldCo executives and boards of directors and the banks and the law firms, all about what is the model and have we perfected the model. So I do think there's some rethinking of things like what percentage of the operating power plant assets are being sold to the YieldCo versus being held by the parent company. Is it 100% or is it less than that? And how is that managed? Secondly, what are the rules by which additional assets will be sold from the old parent company to the YieldCo? And what is the dynamic there? Because the original company has shareholders, the YieldCo has shareholders, and who's winning here between the shareholders? Some management guidelines on that. And so I think there is some model refinement. I hope I haven't been too technical on that, but that's the only way I can answer it is the actual market dynamics.
Can I add one quick thing
Please.
on YieldCos, if I could, also, which is that, and I generally agree with everything Mike was saying, which is that, as I understood it, the idea of the YieldCo was simply we were going to create a vehicle where they, look, an operating, let's say, 10 solar projects kick off a nice steady stream of cash every month. And those are low-risk assets, and we wanted to give investors the opportunity to invest in them and receive basically dividends from those cash flows. Pretty simple idea. And I think, and that was the idea, you were going to get yield from this company. There was a YieldCo. They were supposed to be boring, kind of plain vanilla, the kind of the way my grandma used to invest in companies like Kimberly-Clark and others that just produced dividends. They didn't go up, they didn't go down, they just were steady state. And then what happened was that the valuations of the company started to grow very quickly. People got very excited. Frankly, some of the operators of the yieldcos started to kind of expand the definition of the types of assets that they were putting in there, some that weren't fully developed, some frankly that were higher risk. And the definition got a little blurrier. And I think it's kind of a shame, actually, because these assets are out there. They represent great opportunities for mom and pop investors to just put some money in and earn a nice, steady rate of return. They should not be regarded as risky up and down assets. And yet that's started to take place recently. So I hope people can kind of go back to basics about what the idea of the yieldco was, which was to put operating assets in there that generate steady cash flows and give people the opportunity to enjoy the benefit of those cash flows, but not be exposed to all the risk that goes on around, investing in a solar manufacturing company or any other kind of riskier. Great companies, don't get me wrong, but they're riskier than projects that just generate money, basically.
Maybe one more clarification on that. I won't drag it out too much, but there's two markets: the equity market, which is a risk market, where you have upside growth, and then there's the bond market, which is very fixed income securities, no growth. The bond is the bond. And what we saw here, and Citi and, to be fair, Goldman Sachs really more or less created the idea in the NRG case. And what we have here is a bit of a hybrid. We have the fixed assets with steady cash flow that pays dividends that could go into a securitization, it's called, an asset-backed security, which is a bond. It doesn't grow, but you can buy these. It's like mortgage-backed securities, and you get your fixed income. But in this case, this is a growth market. And these companies, like NRG and others, are creating new projects all the time. Well, what about placing this in the equity market, not the bond market, but the equity market, because it pays a dividend. That's like interest payments in the bond market. It's paying a dividend, but it's managed growth. So that dividend is going to grow over time. So whereas in the bond market, securitized assets don't grow. They are what they are. But here we've created a model where it does grow and more assets can go in. So you get a combination of a fixed income security with growth. And that was the yieldco. So a little refinement, and I think it'll be okay.
Can you also respond to the green fund and how, and then if we can have a brief answer, we can take two more questions.
I think just in terms of, you're asking about the Green Climate Fund?
Yes.
So there's the Green Climate Fund that's been set up. I think it's run out of South Korea. I think they're having their board meetings first week of November. They have 8 proposals that they're looking at approving. One of them I know is to anchor an investment in the Acumen East Africa Renewable Energy Fund. So there are proposals going through there. I think it's somewhat bureaucratic. Others might have more insight there. In terms of Haiti, Jamaica specifically, this is an area where we have done some work. We have an investment advisory business as well, and we've done some work. Certainly a lot of potential for clean energy there. You do have the difficulty that in these island nations, there are powerful existing interests that are benefiting from the sale of diesel from the current status quo and might not necessarily be incentivized to see solar energy come in. For example, I think the State Department and USAID recently announced a $20 million facility to provide development capital similar to what Haim and I benefited from, to help projects come into the Caribbean. So I'd encourage you to look at that. And then I just wanted to add on the storage traction question. So we already have a facility for a safari generation for a safari lodge in Kenya that is totally off-grid. So it's full solar plus battery. They never run the diesel. Maybe they do have the diesel for backup. They might run it 5 hours a month after 4 cloudy days in a row. So storage does already make sense for certain customers. It makes good sense for safari lodges because they're often essentially in the middle of nowhere. They have an extremely expensive diesel supply chain. They're open 7 days a week, so they're always using their energy. They're luxury safari lodges, so there's an advantage to branding in terms of being eco-friendly and totally green. They don't want a loud generator running at night. So they're willing to pay a slight premium off what they would probably pay for pure diesel energy on our finance solution. So that there is a market already for full storage solutions, and that will only expand as prices come down.
We'll take 2 more questions,
Let me give a look.
Sorry? Oh, okay. All right, you.
Good point.
Sorry, who? Yeah, good morning. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm president of a CEO company called Revoltech Energy. I come from Kenya, though I'm based here. I'm a US company. Listening to your presentation, thank you very much. And I just want to recommend my brother who said, thank you to President Obama for Power Africa. Though Power Africa is 6 countries and they are doing a lot. So Africa has 54 countries and I focus in the rural areas of Kenya, where I come from, Western Kenya, looking at industrialization into the rural areas. What are you guys doing to get to the rural areas, not only for the grid, for the cell phones? Now it's all about African cell phones. We have the other part of growing Africa through development and growth. What electricity could you use in those rural areas to make development and growth of countries? And also, we just finished a global diaspora week with the State Department when the Secretary of State launched the Diaspora Day. How do you work with people like us in Africa? And that was about partnership. How do we partner from here? We just see electricity in Africa. Who is doing it? We don't know. What it is doing is done. We don't know. So how do we work with you to make this happen in Africa? The 54 countries, West Africa, East Africa, and everywhere, not only Kenya, in Nairobi, or in Rwanda. How do we do this in all the 54 African countries to have electricity? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm, in no way affiliated or representative of the U.S. government, but Kenya is one of the original Power Africa countries. I believe they're planning to announce the rollout to several more countries in the very near future. Obviously, the balance they have to strike there is they want to make sure the right, institutions and policies are in place that they can feel comfortable providing robust support. In terms of, off-grid rural customers in Kenya, I think last week OPIC announced a $6.5 million loan to Power Hive, which is essentially doing mini grids for villagers. And I forget the exact number, but I think that ideally will be reaching at least 20,000 rural customers. We're working with a number of companies in Kenya right now to see if we can do bankable mini grid projects for these rural customers. It's a different type of project. Also, Google announced last week that they're investing in the Lake Turkana project in northwest Kenya, which is a utility project, but will be, it's a wind power project that will be providing, I think, 15% of the current Kenyan grid. So there is a lot of movement in this space, and I think the key is proving the bankability in the rural space, and you'll see more money come in. You're already seeing it with things like off-grid electric, M-COPA. This is real venture capital, serious commercial dollars that are coming into the space, and that story's only getting better right now.
Sure, and I guess technical point, but I'm pretty sure that Power Africa originally was was only for 6 countries, but has now been expanded continent-wide.
I think the time is up. Are we allowed to go a little beyond? Can we? Yeah. All right. We'll take 2 more questions, please. Yes, please. And over there, the last over there.
Thank you. Randy Freed with ICF. First, terrific presentations. Thanks very much. I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Michael made earlier with regard to the experience in Latin America and Africa, the difficulty of attracting finance in small countries that don't have strong market or policy signals. You had mentioned that in those kinds of situations that it's very important to have regional policies that would be more effective in attracting finance. So my question is, what policies would be most effective at the regional level in terms of attracting the kind of finance that's really needed to scale grid-connected wind and solar? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Marina Yachnis. I'm with Agility. I wanted to ask about a market we haven't touched on yet, which is the residential grid-connected market. So we've talked about off-grid rural customers, C&I, and utility scale. But in Africa, there are a large number of grid-connected urban customers who don't have a reliable source of power. They're forced to use really expensive diesel generators. And yet that market doesn't seem to be taking off, despite the fact that there's an obvious value proposition for them. So I was wondering, and this is a question for anyone who wants to jump in, if you could address the key barriers to scaling that market. Is it policy? Is it a marketing question? Is it finance? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer? Yes, please. Yeah.
All right, let me pick up these two very quickly. I think the major barrier globally on this whole subject is our unfair expectations of regular people to understand electricity at all. I mean, we just blithely say, why don't people go buy a PV panel? I mean, my generation was taught, you know, don't touch the wires, right? Just do the switch. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. I am a trained electrical engineer, so I truly do appreciate that everybody's not one. And most people don't know what electricity is. They're afraid of it for good reasons. They've been taught to keep your hands off. And now we, the policy people, come and say, why don't you take care of yourself? Well, public education about electricity, to me, is a precursor to doing anything off the grid. And people get electrical engineering degrees, work for the utility and apprentice, and grow up over 20, 30 years to learn how to run these very complex electrical grid systems. And yet now we expect regular people to somehow take care of themselves. So I think there's a whole public education missing that's a precursor to all the things we're talking about. On the risk issue, I mean, what policies are needed, whether we're talking public sector finance or private sector finance, particularly private sector, we're dealing with two variables, return and risk. Return is usually not the problem. Usually the numbers work out that there'll be a return on investment given reasonable cost of capital. The issue always is, and is the centerpiece of all policy in this arena, including going back to PURPA, the risk that the utilities wouldn't pay for non-utility power. This is the issue. It is the risk of not being paid for various reasons, whether that's political or utility obstinance or utility in India is short of money or whatever's. The issue is if you invest the capital in a power plant, will you be paid reliably on time every month for 20, 30 years so you can make your debt payments? This is the issue. So it's addressing risk. In the case of not Latin America, but also in the Caribbean, I'll share with you an idea I put forward over a year ago to OPIC, and that is to create an artificial zone in which these projects can get financed in a differentiated way. We have economic development, export-import zones all around the world where if you set up a factory, you won't be charged import-export duties to manufacture there. Well, the analogy here would be to establish what was called in the very brief paper clean energy development zones, which is take a piece of property in Peru and one in Chile and one every place else and have the government legally designate that as a clean energy development zone. It now qualifies for maybe an OPIC policy or a World Bank policy or a USAID policy of giving offtake guarantees to the developer. Offtake means taking the power off the power plant and then paying for it. And it's the risk on being paid. So a guarantee on being paid is called an offtake guarantee. So this package could be placed anywhere in the world, including Africa. Maybe it's the USAID, that's why I put it forward here. Maybe you could promote this. Do we have time to wait for every country in the world to come up to US and European standards of legal structure and so forth? No, we don't, if we're going to deal with climate change. So I'm normally not for government artificialities, but in this case, there's no time to waste. Let's get on with it. And if in every country in Africa, every country in Latin America, frankly, any country in the United States, if it was designated one of these special zones, then it would come with an offtake guarantee that would specifically address the number one financing issue, which is I'm not going to get repaid. Now I know I'm going to get repaid, and now we've solved the problem globally. So there is an answer. It's out there being discussed. And I'm happy to have IFC and USAID know about this and be happy to talk about it later.
I'll take a crack at answering both questions if I could, too. I mean, I think that's a good question in the back about residential solar that's grid connected. And I'm just going to speculate a little bit here, which is a couple things. First, the scale of the sheer number of people who are underserved in terms of electricity is so enormous. There's so many different places to pick from that I can sort of understand why that might not be the first on the sort of new energy entrepreneurs list. and I'll speculate on this. And Jake mentioned earlier the advantages of so-called white space. Well, the closer you get to interfacing with the existing utility, the bigger the challenges, I think, can become. So first, solar in the residential sphere often can work well because of net metering, meaning that you essentially, I'm oversimplifying, but you can effectively sell some of the electricity into the grid. A lot of utilities, I think, are not set up to do that and will not necessarily be welcoming of that, and in fact might be very controlling about the idea of anybody sort of independently starting to generate power within their existing market. So I think I'm going to just sort of speculate that I think that's a reason why that's a more challenging market in some ways to work in than to just jump right into some total space that's not being served really, at all. Or if you're going to make the time and investment like Chaim's done on a larger scale project, at least the return on investment will be something more reasonable because the project itself will be much larger. So just one thought. And one quick thing on regional policies. I mean, we mentioned Latin America. I think the other issue is also about making sure that there's sufficient, when we think regionally, and I think that was the original point, we think, is there demand in the right kind of way? In my view on Latin America is, look, Brazil's a massive country in its own market. They've created certain types of reverse auctions to try and build, clean energy projects that have been very successful. I don't necessarily see them as needing to be regional. But when you look at Central America, there's been efforts around the so-called CIAPAC, which is a transmission line between all those countries. And the more that gets built out and the more that becomes an open market, the more you can enjoy the benefits of geothermal in one country and solar in another country and wind in another country. And the less those countries need to be reliant on any kind of imports from Mexico or elsewhere. So I think that's one area for regionality in terms of policymaking where you could see more of.
Maybe I'll just add, in terms of the net metering piece, I know that a lot of assignments were given to Wilson Center, but it doesn't have to only be the Wilson Center. I've been asked by a head of a utility specifically, can you help me with a policy paper on net metering? I'm not an expert, but I know that it's something that a lot of utilities want to understand better. They know that there is potential. They want to understand how it would work. They want to understand what policies have been done in other countries, in other states, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and how that might apply to the context of the African context. I know that that's definitely a desiderata, and it could be very helpful in pushing that forward. And I don't know exactly your role, but if you're involved and interested in studying that, I can connect you with people who want that to be studied in their country. And then the other piece, I think, is just, we mentioned this earlier, battery storage as prices go down. That's sort of the holy grail. I would not be surprised if within a few years, maybe 4, 5, 6 years, it will be it will be not only the elite, but others will also be able to afford it, and I guess that's all of our hopes.
And then I think just,
Last word.
yeah, this challenge of market education, building demand. We have a product that does work for the market. It does make sense, solar in these markets, but now it's a question of building the education and building the demand. In California now, most people who have good roof space have probably been talked to by someone at some point about solar or seen their neighbor do it. It's nothing like that in Africa. The small installations we've done so far are the largest installations serving commercial customers. So that's something where I think there is a need for policy and development can really come together. And then I'm sorry, I realized I neglected your question on the diaspora part, and I want to emphasize that, most of my colleagues on our team are diaspora. They are from East Africa or from South Africa and have been educated in the West and now have returned to work on these solutions. So just because of the rather homogeneous composition of this panel, don't think that this is, an American story. These organizations are being, the companies on the ground, are being led and co-led and have management teams, that are African, that are from these countries, and often come back because they've built talent at Goldman or McKinsey in places like New York and DC and are now eager to return and apply those skills in a place where they can have more impact, than increasing somebody's return by a couple bips or doing a mid-market buyout in the US. They can really feel like they're having an impact where it's needed most.
I think we are really running short of time now, and I'd like to close. I'd like to thank you, my guests here, for a wonderful interactive, and you audience for a very wonderful question and answer session. Thank you all.
Great.